Hi, everyone. I'm Kat, and I'm here with Emily, and we did research with Dr. Salaska this semester. And the title of our project is You Are What You Read, Predicting Personality, Empathy, and Interpersonal Support from Reading Habits.
So we're going to look at previous research, the method of our study, our results from the data we collected, and we're going to discuss what those results mean, and then we're going to look at how future studies can contribute to this research.
So, starting with what's already been studied, we mostly looked first at fiction reading and found that fiction reading habits are typically formed in childhood. So, if you're reading a lot as a child, you're more likely to be reading a lot as an adult. We also found that fiction reading is associated with better verbal ability, better reading comprehension, more empathy, and better personal intelligence. Furthermore, we also found that fiction reading is associated with story induced affective empathy, which basically is a tendency to become absorbed in what you're reading. So if you're more likely to be transported into the story as you're reading, you're more likely to be using this type of empathy and developing your overall empathy. We also looked into previous research about empathy, and most of it focused on perspective taking empathy, which is basically when you're learning about a new character and trying to see things from their point of view and understand their emotions. You're using this type of empathy and developing your overall empathy again.
Then we also looked at personality traits using the big five traits, which are openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism. And previous research has found that high levels of openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and then low levels of extroversion are associated with empathy. Additional research found that high levels of openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion predicted more engagement in fiction reading rather than nonfiction reading. And then for interpersonal support, which is the perception of a person's social circle and who they can reach out to when they're struggling. Previous research found that engagement in fiction is associated with higher perceptions of social support and also increased social abilities such as empathy or the ability to read body language.
So moving on to what we hypothesized, I hypothesized that high conscientiousness and high openness will lead to greater exposure to fiction and increased engagement with fiction, and in turn, that will predict higher levels of empathy.
I built off these trait hypotheses and also predicted that engagement with fiction will lead to higher levels of empathy, and then this in turn will lead to increased perception of interpersonal support.
So moving on to how did we study this? So we used 6 survey measures, and they are listed here. As you can see, we used the IRI, the ART-R, some questions about percentage of reported fiction and nonfiction reading, the BFI2, the ICEL, and the TOPI Mini. The IRI measured empathy. The ART-R measured amount of fiction reading. And that in tandem with our questions about percentage of reported fiction and nonfiction gave us a measure of reading habits for participants. The BFI2 measured personality traits, the 5 previously mentioned. The ICEL measured perceived social support, and the TOPI Mini measured personal intelligence.
Moving on to our results, we conducted 3 regression analyses for our variables and found that with fiction exposure, low levels of extroversion and high levels of openness were significant predictors of exposure to fiction, and this accounted for 15% of the variance.
Similarly, empathy was also significantly predicted by the variables. However, only high agreeableness and high neuroticism were significant predictors. However, the whole regression accounted for 36% of the variance in empathy.
For interpersonal support, we found that high agreeableness and low levels of empathy were significant predictors, contrary to our hypothesis, and this accounted for 37% of the variance.
So now moving on to a discussion about the results. Well, first of all, our results suggest that there is a link between empathy, personality, reading habits, and perceived interpersonal support. However, we only had 56 participants, and according to conventional research methods, we would need at least 20 participants per measure or predictor to have adequate power within our study, so our study was not adequately powered. And discussing more about what could have affected results, we discussed mostly participant demographics because most participants were of the same age, same gender, from the same school. This definitely could have affected results. For example, most of our participants probably had a shared curriculum, read the same books, and this could have affected their reading habits, results, and the types of stories that they were reporting.
Future research to build upon this current study should look at varied demographics, so like different levels of socioeconomic status, different backgrounds of education, different age ranges. We also would want to standardize the conditions of the study because our participants took these online in the comfort of their own home, which could lead to different environmental distractions. And perhaps they had more fiction lying around, less fiction lying around. This could have led to a change in the results. Additionally, we would really want to identify causal relationships. So our regression analyses did not only identify predictors between the variables, they didn't identify the way the relationship is flowing. And lastly, we want to check for order effects of our measures. So how different measures influence the way the participants engaged with them and responded to the questions.
Thank you for listening, and we look forward to answering your questions on Friday.